All right, looks like the room is filling up. So I think with that, we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Kirby. I'm an associate on the member relations team at GRESB. And welcome to the second Q&A session that GRESB is hosting this year. So firstly, we want to thank all of you for joining, during a very busy time of the year for you. We're seeing a lot of activity in the GRESB portal and hoping to see, decent growth again this year in our responses. And on the line today, we have quite a few from the GRESB team. So we have myself, Max Maywald, Victor Fonseca, Izzy Groger, and Charles Van Thiel from the real estate team. And we also have Ruben Langbroek, who is your, Asia Pac head of Asia Pacific. So yeah, we've got quite a few of us. And yeah, I think it'll be a nice dynamic session with many of us being able to speak. So with that, I think I can go ahead and share my screen so we can get the presentation going. 1 second. All right, this should be up now. Yeah, so we'll do the quick introduction of our team. I've run through that already, and then we'll go through several different topics before opening it up to the Q&A session. We've had a few questions submitted in advance, like 5 or 6, but it would be helpful for everyone. You'll see at the bottom of your screen in Zoom, the Q&A function. So as we're moving through some of the first questions and topics, we encourage everyone to go ahead and submit questions using the Q&A function. This can help queue it up so that when we do get to the open format part of the presentation, we can go back and forth and have the questions ready. So these can be submitted at any time from now. So yeah, go ahead and please use that function. And now I will turn it over to Izzy, on part of the real estate team, to walk us through the response check. Izzy.
Thank you, Kevin. So hi, everyone. My name is Izzy. I might have interacted with some of you through our help desk platform, because I'm the one who's mainly in charge of answering any tickets that are coming in. So today I will give you a brief overview of the response check. So what is the response check? A response check is a high-level check of your assessment responses prior to your final submission. You can request such a response check through the assessment portal. Just simply click on your reporting entity and then navigate to the shop, and there you can then purchase a response check. Before I move on, I want to remind everyone that we have 2 different deadlines. So we've got one deadline for the assessment, which is July 1st, as you probably know. And then there is a second deadline for the response check. So you can request a response check until June 1st. Yeah, so the response check is carried out by our third-party validation team, SRI, and features a careful review of your assessment responses, followed by a 1-hour discussion call. Please note that the response check does not exclude you from any element of the validation process, nor does it guarantee you a better GRESB score. So what is the response check? How is the whole scheduling process? So as mentioned before, you can request a response check through our assessment portal at any time after you start an assessment, and then you're then prompted to schedule a call with our validation team. Please make sure that you complete the assessment at least 1 week prior to your call. So it gives the validation team time to really properly review all your responses. After your call, you will then receive a feedback report, which you then can use to review and revise your assessment responses. We strongly encourage you all to schedule your call as early as possible, as we only have a fixed number of available slots and they are filling up. And yeah, last but not least, your calls can be scheduled between May 1st and June 24th. So that still gives you at least a week of time before your final submission on July 1st. All this information can also be found on our website under gresb.com/response-check. So moving on, I would like to give you an overview of the benefits of the response check. So first of all, it helps you to reduce errors that may adversely impact your assessment results, but it also identifies inconsistent responses and incorrect answer formats. A response check also ensures that your submission is as complete as possible. And lastly, it provides you the opportunity to ask for additional guidance and clarification on the GRESB assessment indicators. So the response check scope for the real estate assessment includes all scored indicators for all three components, so management, performance and development, and also includes a review of entity and reporting characteristics. Please note that the asset level reporting for real estate, the real estate performance component is not included in the response check scope, as reporting here is subject to a comprehensive set of automatic validation checks, such as consistency checks or logic checks, which are embedded in our asset portal. And yeah, just as a little reminder, all this information can be found on our website. If you have any questions, you can always contact us through our contact form. And yeah, I'll now hand over to you, Max.
Yes, thank you very much, Izzy. Also, happy good morning and good afternoon from my side. Let's talk now about the reporting boundaries review. I mean, as you might all know, we have a certain reporting scope requirement in our assessment, meaning that you all need to report on the entire portfolio that you have. This also includes all landlord and tenant controlled areas, but also your joint ventures. And for joint ventures, we have our certain rules, meaning if you have a stake in an asset or another company that is exceeds 25%, you will have to include this asset or all assets from this other fund within your reporting boundaries. And then you have two options how to report on these, meaning either you report on the GAV equivalent to the share of your stake in this asset, or you report on the full GAV of this asset. But however, please remind that you always need to report on the full asset's floor areas and performance data in this case. And then we have this reporting boundaries review now in place, which we started last year. And here we select a certain amount of submissions every single year based on certain parameters. And this means we look at listed and non-listed entities. We see whether you had an increase or decrease in your overall GAV, or in the count of your assets, or within your floor area sizes between last year and this year. And in total, we approximately select like around 5% of your submissions. And then we do like mainly checks on your asset count and the percentage of GAV per property type. And for this, we use, for example, the evidence scope template that you can see under Appendix 2C, but also use your annual reports or other documents that you upload in our assessment. And the importance why we actually check, especially the asset count and the percentage of GAV per property type, is because we use these for your peer group allocation, which is then used actually for benchmarking purposes in our performance component. Non-compliance with our requirements may actually lead to a request to adjust your reporting boundaries afterwards. And now we can already see the timeline for this. So on June 15th, our third-party validation team from SRI will actually contact all selected entities. So all of you that were selected will be notified on June 15th. However, this doesn't mean that you need to do anything from this point onwards, because on July 1st, we actually will commence with this boundaries review, meaning at this point of time, then SRI will actually have a look through all documents, try to reconcile the asset count, percentage of GAV per property type, also with coordination with us to do like some consistency checks there. And then on July 10th, we will then again contact all of you, either with a happy news, more or less, that everything was fine, or if we found some discrepancies, you will then have 5 days to actually either upload additional information to us, so we can do another check, or actually increase the reporting boundaries if certain parts of your portfolio were missing. And this then could become like a little bit of an iterative process. And overall, the reporting boundaries review is then concluded on July 31st, when we hopefully have all of your submissions final. That's what from my side. Now over to Victor for new materials that we have.
Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Victor. I'm gonna talk about the new materials that GRESB has released in 2021 on the top of the core guidance materials that we release annually. These materials are the aggregation rules handbook and the asset portal validation rules. It's important to note that even though our assessment remained stable in 2021, GRESB has worked to improve our documentation to you in order to improve the user experience. So starting with the aggregation rules handbook, this document, the intent of it is to provide transparency to you when it comes to the operations that happen in the back end of the GRESB portal. We often receive questions from you asking how is the asset level data aggregated into property subtype level data, which we display in the assessment portal and as well in benchmark reports. So GRESB has decided to disclose all the calculation steps in order to aggregate this raw data into metrics that we score in our assessment. So this document covers data coverage, like-for-like, both like-for-like change and data availability, and also the calculation of intensities. And we incentivize you to have a look in this document in case you have any concern or seeking any clarification regarding data aggregation. And the second one is the asset portal validation rules. This document consists in a flow chart to better illustrate the relationship between different fields that we have in the asset portal. Our asset portal consists of a series of logical checks that guide participants to amend any incorrect field that they have reported if it was directly in the asset portal or through the upload of the asset spreadsheet. And these logical checks follow the aggregation rules, and the intent of this document is to illustrate these relationships as well clarify what are the validation rules that are present at the asset portal. So back to Kevin, and that's it for me.
Yes, thanks, Victor, and thanks guys for taking us through that. And with the aggregation rules handbook, I would highly recommend any data geeks to check out that reference. It's got some very intense formulas that I think anyone would really like to pull apart. So it's a great resource for you guys to use this year. So with that, I think we can move into the open format Q&A session. So I'm already seeing, I think we have 10 questions already submitted. So we can, we'll start with the questions submitted in advance. But yeah, we encourage you to use the Q&A function as we move through some of these questions. So with that, we can go to the first question. So I'll read these aloud. I think that's maybe easiest. And then, you know, we've got some people assigned to answer these. So how do we determine our portfolio predominant property type if we have an equal proportion of retail and office assets? We also have a separate portfolio of mixed use developments. Victor, will you take us through this one?
Yes. So when you say have the equal proportion, you can talk about floor area, number of assets, or even GAV allocated in each property type. To be consistent with our peer group allocation, our classification is based on GAV allocated. So depending on where the majority of your GAV is allocated, that's how you define your predominant property type in your assessment.
Perfect, thanks, Victor.
Can I add a bit of a flavor to this?
Yeah, go for it, Charles.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Charles Van Thiel. So the reason why we're asking the predominant property type in the assessment, you could even argue, well, if I'm actually submitting all my assets, why do I need to enter my predominant property type? Because you have my assets and my property type per asset already. Keep in mind that some participants, a very, very low number of participants, do only submit the management component, do not submit the performance component, which means that they're not submitting all their assets by one. They're only completing, you know, the first set of indicators that only sit within the management component. And for these participants, we need to also classify them into what we call the management component benchmark group, which is not the same as the peer group, which only applies for the combination of management and performance. But we also need to classify them so that we can benchmark them against peers. And to do that, since we don't have any information on their assets in the first place, we have to ask an additional question on what is the predominant property type in the portfolio. So Victor's answer is spot on. So let's try to be as consistent as possible between what you submit to the management component and what you submit and what we aggregate from your asset level information in the performance component. And let's use the gap as a main weighting factor when it comes to calculating the predominant proportion in your portfolios.
Thank you, Charles. With the next question, please explain the detailed split of the scoring system and elaborate further on how is the scoring for each section evaluated. Max, I believe this one's for you.
Yes, exactly. Since this question is quite elaborate and comprehensive, I would like to refer you for this question to our scoring document. In the scoring document, we actually show per indicator the exact split how we actually score them. So for example, when you have like an indicator with certain subsections, we show you exactly a certain fraction of points that you would receive per subsection, which then aggregated to an overall score for the indicator. So in this document, you can really find all relevant information about how we score all of this, including also like when we use certain percentages as like a multiplier. We explain exactly how we create our benchmark groups, how we then calculate also our scores on the performance indicators. So this is a really document that should answer all of these questions, or really give you a great overview about how we score things. And if you should have any other questions about this, you can always contact us via our contact form, and we then are more than happy to answer your questions on a more specific indicator via email.
Great, thanks, Max. And we also have the 2021 indicator summary, which provides more of a high level, it's a 2-3 pager that it's a really nice, it's a pretty resource you can share with, anyone in your organization to see what topics are really covered within the GRESB assessment. And it also includes the percentage allocation of each indicator to the overall score, as well as the number of points. So the scoring document is really good for, granular level or granular scoring levels in terms of how much each issue contributes to a single indicator, but the indicator summary, which is also on our resources page, is a good high level overview of that. With the next question, can you clarify on tenant area, what does landlord controlled versus tenant controlled mean? Izzy, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So as you all know, in our asset spreadsheet, you can either report tenant controlled or landlord controlled. So landlord controlled areas are those which the landlord is deemed to have operational control. So it's really about the operational control. So operational control is defined as the ability to introduce or implement operating policies or health and safety policies, or also environmental policies. So if the landlord is the one who has the most authority, you would report on landlord control. If landlord and tenant both have the ability to implement and introduce the mentioned policies, you would still report on landlord controlled. However, if you have one single tenant that has the authority to introduce or implement any of those policies, you would then report on tenant controlled. So to conclude, it is all about the operational control.
Nice, thank you, Izzy.
You're welcome.
Does GRESB have any recommendations for policy templates to build off of? Max?
Yes. In the end, since we actually validate your supporting evidence, we need to remain impartial, and therefore we do not really favor any templates, so to say. Therefore, the quick answer is we just don't. And especially, it's also important to note that we don't really are allowed to give any advice on these policy documents, since we actually need to be like an independent third party actually validating these documents. Therefore, you can try to use other entities templates more or less when they hand them out to you, when you have like public documents that they can find. Maybe draw like some like conclusions from like listed companies that publish actually their policies. But in the end, we can't really give any advice on these or offer any templates, since we need to remain impartial.
Great, thanks, Max. And yeah, that's a good note. A lot of listed entities actually have many of their documents publicly available, and even private entities as well. So, if you're really looking there, I think, a quick Google of some listed companies in your region can help guide you in maybe setting up some of these policies. Of course, making sure that you are complying with the GRESB requirements as outlined in the reference guide in terms of what needs to be covered within it. We have a validation requirements section for each piece of evidence that is validated. So if you can always reference that as well. Next question. So does GRESB specifically require SASB, GRI, and TCFD alignment, or is it more of a recommendation? Izzy?
Yes, really good question. So we do not require alignment. However, when we develop our assessment, we do heavily rely on those mentioned frameworks, especially when it comes to indicators and the intent in our assessment.
Nice. Easy answer. Thanks, Izzy. Next one. In case we have 100% vacancy and no active contract for utilities, should we put 0 in the asset spreadsheet or leave it blank? Victor?
Yes. So I think I understand this question in 2 different ways. If you have 100% vacancy, you should report your vacancy rate as 100%. And when it comes to the consumption data, if you report any floor area covered, the asset portal will expect that your consumption will be different than 0. So leaving blank, it will trigger an error, and this will prevent you from submitting your performance components. So once completing the asset spreadsheet, if you have any floor area covered, please put 0 in the consumption if there was no consumption in this area.
Nice, thank you, Victor. So that does it for all of the pre-submitted questions, but we do have quite a few that have come in through the chat. So what we'll do now is move into those. And to understand which question we're talking about, I will read them aloud because everyone on the line can also open up the Q&A function to see the questions that have been asked. But so that we know which question we're referring to, we can I'll read it aloud. So with the first question from Stephen, so regarding improvements implemented in the last 3 years, what about where smart meters were installed 4 or 5 years ago? Does this still count?
Yes, I can take this one. So like the intent of this indicator is to track ongoing activity in order to find improvement opportunities for your portfolio. So that's why we established together with our governance groups this time window of 3 years. So if it's outside this 3 years window, unfortunately, you cannot report these efficiency measures in the indicators RA3 to RA5. But this should already be reflected in, for example, smart meters and a higher data coverage. So this is already reflected in other performance indicators. So yeah, if it's outside this 3 years window, you cannot report these efficiency measures in these indicators.
Yeah, good point by Victor, and that it has, just because you have smart meters and it may not be recognized within efficiency measures, there's plenty of other areas in the assessment where you will benefit from having these installed. And of course, it is an efficiency measure, so you'll see results from that. The next question is, so if the development section is being completed, do the development sites, development assets also go into the asset spreadsheet?
I can take this one again. So if the development asset is completed during the reporting year and it becomes operational, this asset should be a report in the asset spreadsheet, and you need to reflect the status of the asset in the reporting characteristics of the asset, meaning while it was a development component, you just define the status as being while it was a development asset, you just define the status date find the reporting characteristics. So this also should be reflected.
Great. Thanks, Victor. This one. So Charles will be answering this one. So when entering fuel consumption, should the car park area of the building be included in the area covered, not car parks that are normally serviced by gas?
Sure, thanks to outdoor. Outdoor car parks do not need to be included in the overall asset size of the assets reported to GRESB, and therefore their corresponding asset size do not need to be included in the floor area covered when you enter fuel consumption or any kind of energy consumption, really. However, if we're talking about an indoor car park and that you've included that car park in the asset size of the reported assets, then, and if that area is serviced by fuel, in your case, you're talking about fuel consumption, then this area should be treated as any other areas of the assets. So it should be included in the floor area. So first make your distinction between whether it is an indoor or outdoor, and then if it's serviced, if it's indoor, if it's serviced, it should be treated as other areas, and if it's not serviced, then it should not be treated as the other areas. But that in this case, it works exactly the same way as the other areas in the assets. We don't treat that areas differently.
Great, thank you, Charles. The next question, so around water consumption. So can you clarify whether rainwater captured and or water recycled in the building should be included in the initial water consumption? It is ambiguous based on the asset spreadsheet instructions. Max?
Yes, I mean, here is the same as for energy with renewable energy as well. You should always report the entire total consumption of the asset, meaning for energy and water, under the respective fields. And then in a separate note, you should then report the reused or renewable energy, or reused water or renewable energy. Because in the end, what we do for scoring as well is we calculate the percentage of your total consumption, water or energy, that is either reused or renewable energy. And therefore, you should always report your entire total consumption, including everything reused or renewable, and then in a separate section, what is actually reused or renewable from that part.
Very clear, thanks, Max. Next question around gross floor area. So in Australia, we normally do not have any data on common area or internal car park areas. What suggestions do you have for estimating the size of these?
I can take this one. So we do have in our appendix 3A of the reference guide, when it comes to property type classification, we provide the common area ratio exactly for these purposes. Once you only have the net leasable area and you do not know what is your gross floor area. So depending on your property type, because this is property type specific, you can find the common area ratio and then like apply this ratio in order to estimate the size of your common areas in your building.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. Next question. So many companies have several subsidiaries and entities around the world to represent their presence worldwide. How to define what would be the number of assets that need to be reported to GRESB? What if other assets are controlled by another entity? Both entities are representing the same company, but the second entity does not want to submit for GRESB. Max?
Yes, this is again based on the reporting scope that I talked about earlier. Since you are required to report on the entire portfolio, you should always report on every single asset that we have a stake in, if this stake is above 25%. And therefore, you can then see based on this, the number of assets that you actually need to include. And if there might be like an entity you have a stake in, for example, you should still report on all these assets. But if they don't want to report on them, they just don't report to us. Because it could actually happen that in a joint venture, certain asset is like report to us twice, once from like your side and once actually from the side of another entity that report also to us.
Thanks, Max. I can also add a bit of a content here because it is a complicated question indeed, and you know, some financial structure of companies can be quite complex as well. And I think there was also a sub question in that question as to what if a part of the organization wants to report and another part doesn't want? Like how do I deal with this? You know, in the end, you should keep in mind that the one of the core purposes of GRESB is really to provide information to our investor members as well, in addition to going back to you through a benchmark report, which means that the completion, as Max mentioned, the completion and accuracy of the portfolio is of utmost importance when reporting to us, which means that if there is a part of the portfolio managed by a separate entity that is not willing to participate in GRESB, you can always include those assets, but not reporting on the performance indicators of those assets, because we have, you know, we do score and we do capture data coverage, and if you don't have any performance data on those assets, it is simply a matter of including those assets in your portfolio, but you will not be benefiting from, you know, the points corresponding to their data coverage and their performance indicators. But, you know, as a first step, that is a way you can choose to report, and then over time, hopefully, that sub-portfolio managed by a separate entity will be willing to participate to create, an aggregate, a benchmark report at the level of the legal entity reporting to GRESB.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. And I think, if there are specific questions around this, we're happy to, the member relations team or real estate can help very much with helping you define exactly what should be reported so that you do comply with the requirements.
Just to chip in here quickly, Kevin.
Yeah.
Just saw another question that is actually asking whether all of the assets need to be included for the performance review as well. It's just to add on there, if like an asset is a standing investment and you need to report on this asset, this will be part of the reporting, the performance component, meaning all assets that you need to report to us are part then of this performance review overall.
Yeah, that's a good point. So even in the case you don't have data for an asset, you still need to define that asset as part of the portfolio. So essentially that asset should have a row in the asset spreadsheet, even in the case of no data, as it's mandatory to include the entire investable vehicle. Next question from Stephen for you, Charles. So when there is a vacancy tenancy in an office building, do we count this as tenant controlled or landlord controlled? When occupied, would it be tenant controlled? I think that should be a question mark, but I think you'll clarify, Charles.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, good question, Stephen. Thanks for that. It is a really good question in the sense that the very fact of an area being leased out or not actually impacts its control type classification. And I think the answer to this question is very much, well, it depends. I would say if you have an asset that is vacant throughout the year for the entire year, you're probably going to be, classifying that area as a landlord control will probably be more correct, because anyway, there's nothing that is controlled by any tenant throughout the year since there is no tenants. However, if you've got a few months, let's say during the year, where it is vacant, you have a few months that are technically land control because it's vacant, but the other 9 months of the year are tenant control. And in that case, since you end up in the asset level spreadsheet, you do only have one option to classify an area throughout the year, not two sub classification for two sub periods of the year. Then it makes more sense to classify this area as tenant control. Keep also in mind that we do collect the vacancy rates, and I know there is another question from you, Stephen, on this one. I'm sure you know that we do capture the vacancy rates to reflect, the level of vacancy of the asset throughout the year, and hopefully this percentage will be catering for these vacant areas, the 3 months vacant area that we mentioned earlier. So yeah, there's a bit of judgment here, but again, I think if it's throughout the year, it does make sense to classify as landlord control. And in fact, it's not going to matter that much because you're probably not going to have much performance data anyway. And if it's for a portion of the year, it makes more sense to follow the main trend of the year, which is probably tenant control.
Nice, thanks, Charles. I think you'll be answering the next one as well. So a residential real estate developer have different types of residential projects across a region. How do you allocate them so they can be compared against peers?
Yes, great, thank you. I took this one because it's actually the way we determine peer groups is actually quite complex, and that's why we have an entire appendix in our reference guide to share with you all, the actual order that the algorithm goes through when it comes to determining peer groups for both the performance component and the development component. So I really invite you to have a look at appendix, I think it's 3B, if I'm not mistaken. Let me have a quick look. Yeah, appendix 3B, you see you have two really big tables. One is for the performance component, the other one is for the development component. And we do start with some criteria. For example, the first criteria we look at is the property type, and the property type, the second one is the region. So we do combine these two criteria for determining peer groups with using thresholds as to how much of the gross asset value of that asset is deemed in that region to determine the region of the peer group. How much of that gross asset value of that portfolio is in that property type to determine the property type of the peer group. So it's a little bit of a complex approach, but everything is shared in the appendix 3B. So I really encourage you to have a look at that appendix.
Thank you, Charles. So the next question from Lauren. I work for a sustainability consulting agency, and we have been asked to take real estate retail clients to help them with their first year of GRESB reporting. Is that possible to gather and report data on their behalf? Max.
Yes, I mean, we have a large number of consultancies actually that help entities like yours to report to us. So this is more than possible and actually quite common practice that we see. And in this case, because like sometimes even consultancies have longer lasting relationship with us already and actually are quite familiar with our assessment. And therefore, especially for new participants, actually sometimes quite advantage or like of an advantage if they have a consultant who's already familiar with our assessment to actually do this first year reporting for them.
Yeah, that's a good point, Max. So I think I looked at this last week, and it's somewhere between 70 and 80% of all participants with GRESB have some type of external consultant, solutions provider, data partner that help them with their GRESB submission. But typically, these consultants are not just helping with GRESB. It's more of looking at your ESG program as an entity and seeing where you can improve upon that. I mean, as you know, GRESB is just one of many let's call them standards assessments that companies report to on an annual basis. And it really just depends on the internal capacity of the organization to handle ESG. I mean, if it's a team that, if it's a company that doesn't have an ESG team at all, to ramp up those efforts, it's highly likely that you will need some type of, professional help in doing so. But if you have a team built out of 5 people on an ESG team, or even just a couple, depending on the size of the organization, it would be very, possible to respond to GRESB with that internal capacity. So yeah, it depends a bit. Okay, next question from Janine. So for you, Victor, so when an asset is part owned, do we include the consumption and area for the whole building or just the portion owned of the asset? That's a very good question.
Yes, so as Max actually mentioned this before once he was explaining the questions that submitted to us, you do need to report the whole consumption data of your asset, regardless of the percent of ownership that you have on it. We have introduced like a percent of ownership field this year. Is a voluntary field. You can specify that your percentage of ownership, but still you need to report the consumption data corresponding to the whole floor area of the building. And I see that you also have asked like a question: what happens if these assets is separate entities? Should we have the same GRESB asset ID? No, the GRESB asset ID is specific to your entity. This is ID that GRESB creates to track your asset within your asset portal. So no, they will not have the same GRESB asset ID. This is going to be specific for your entity.
Thanks, Victor. And I also just want to commend everyone on the line, because I think the questions that have been submitted are really great and they keep coming in. So yeah, good job all around. A question from Lauren. So can you clarify if it's still possible to report to GRESB for a company with their first year reporting and not have the scores publicly available for that first year? So Max, about the grace period?
Yes, exactly. We still have this grace period in place. That means that all first year participants can actually select they want to report under the grace period, giving them the opportunity to actually have a trial year, more or less. And this means that your name will, for example, still be visible in our portal to investors. However, investors cannot request access to your results. And therefore, yeah, as I already mentioned, you really have complete freedom in the first year with nobody having access to your results, and then can like hopefully improve in the second year, then publicly share your results.
Yeah, and then a good build onto that is at the end of your first year, if you're satisfied with your score, you actually have the opportunity to elect to then disclose that score. So I think we do see a lot of people first select grace period, and then depending on the results can then share that. So if you're questioning whether you should do it, I would recommend, yes, electing into grace period, and then you always have the opportunity to elect out of it. If you do submit the assessment without grace period selected, you will not be able to revert that change. So for first year participants, do pay attention to that selection. I think it's better to be safe than sorry. So yeah, you can always change it to disclosing your score later if you would like to. Next question. So can you use energy payment to convert the consumption data and submit to GRESB? If for some assets we cannot provide the actual data, can we use this approach to submit the performance data?
Yeah, so on our assessment, we require participants to report actual data. So like you can use the utility bills as a proxy to understand what is the consumption profile of your asset, but you need to report the actual data. In case you cannot provide actual energy data, you will need to report this floor area of your asset as unknown consumption, meaning that you do not have any data coverage when it comes to this floor area. So this will be reflecting your data coverage. But again, we do only collect actual data. We do have some exceptions to that, which is clarified in our appendix, the estimation methodology, but that's limited to that.
Yeah, very clear. Thanks, Victor. So the next question's about the GRESB member agreement. So Charles will be taking this one. It is quite long, but yeah, maybe I won't read this just because they're at the top. But yeah, it's the top question in the Q&A for everyone to reference.
Sure. In a nutshell, Vanessa is asking, our commercial team at GRESB has been reaching out to all existing participants, to sign the membership agreement to be, legally contractually linked to GRESB in the context of the reporting to GRESB. I think for specific commercial questions, I'd be happy to follow up with someone from the commercial pillar of GRESB to make sure that we, since it's probably very specific to your organization, Vanessa. So we'll be in touch right after this Q&A session with someone from the commercial pillar on this. But you had a second sub question, which I'm happy to take. You're also asking what exact information should you submit to GRESB? Do you need to list all the asset names, or could you just list out the major property types as followed? If your question relates to the completion of the portfolio, that was something we covered earlier with Max. I'm confirming you that you should report on all assets owned by your reporting entity, which means all assets, not just the major ones. And in terms of asset names, asset name is if you look at the GRESB asset spreadsheet, the asset names are an optional field. You can actually, I'm not sure if they're an optional field, but you don't need to enter your actual asset name. You can also enter any kind of assets identification number that you're using internally that no one would understand, no one externally would understand. So the asset name doesn't need to be something that anyone could identify the asset just based on that information. If you don't feel comfortable sharing that confidential information with us. I hope that clarifies. And again, we'll be in touch with someone from the commercial team to make sure that your other question on the participant agreement has been covered. Thanks, Vanessa.
Yeah, Vanessa. The email probably came from me, so we can. I'll contact you after, and we'll make sure that we have all our records straight from our side. Okay, the next question. So referring to last year's results, the results were distinguished referring to the property type. Could you explain more in detail how a company is classified by property type? Is it based on the asset spreadsheet we submit? Max.
Yes. Short answer, yes, it is. What we look at is the percentage that are actually allocated to a certain property type. If this percentage exceeds 75%, then your predominant property type would be, for example, office, and then you would be like in a peer group based on office. If we can't determine like a predominant property type for you, we then go gradually a little bit lower to either diversified within two different property types. For example, when you have like predominant, like 40% allocated to office and 40% allocated to retail, you would then be diversified office retail. And if you have a very diversified property portfolio, where we can't distinguish even two predominant property types, then we would just be diversified overall. Kevin, you're mute.
Goodness. Okay. Thank you, Max. Sometimes it's very hard to get to the top bar where I can unmute myself and not also change slides. Yeah, so next question, Max, this one's for you. So this is a follow-up to the rainwater recycled question. So we have no way to measure the quantity of the actual water recycled. We only know the quantity of potable water through the water meter. What should we do in this situation?
Yeah, in this case, unfortunately, when you don't have the data on your recycled water, there's unfortunately no way for you to report on this, and therefore this part of the assessment will not have an answer from your side.
Yeah, that's correct. But it would be good to note that. So when you're looking at the overall consumption, as some of this water is coming from water recycling and reuse, your overall total potable water used will be lower. So your water use intensity would be reflected as lower and would reflect the efficiency coming from that. But it would be important to begin to be able to quantify that so you can report a percentage of water recycled and reused. And I think, probably from a disclosure perspective, that's something the entity would want to do. So as you can either set targets around water reuse and recycling, or publicly communicate X% of our water is reused and recycle. But yeah, as I mentioned, it would be reflected in the overall intensity of water used. So question from Jamie. So if the multi-tenant property has a few floors under construction, this vacant area is considered to be under landlord control. However, the occupied areas are considered tenant control. Is it the full building tenant or landlord controlled? For you, Charles.
Yeah, happy to take that one. Again, I think we had a similar question earlier on floor area classification depending on vacancy. Now it's about construction. I think the same answer really applies. In the end, you have one area classification in the spreadsheets, and because the spreadsheet is a model in the end, right? And the reality is that you have some part of the asset that are deemed landlord controlled, some others tenant controlled. In this one, actually, again, it's a little bit judgmental based on the proportions. If the majority of your asset is actually under construction, then that asset will probably qualify for the major renovation status as a whole. If, as you know, we do apply a 50% threshold on the floor area impacted by renovation work. And if you have more than 50% of the area impacted by that renovation work, the entire asset is classified as under renovation, which means that you're not required to report on the performance data for that asset. If less than 50% of that area is under renovation, it means that it's still considered as a standing investment, as an operation asset, which means that implicitly, a very large proportion of that asset will be operating and will be under the control of the tenant, which means that it makes more sense to classify that asset as that area as a tenant control. So again, a bit judgmental, but also keep in mind that in addition to the question that we previously covered on the vacancy rate, that does have an impact on the area classification. Here we're talking about construction or renovation, and in this case, you also have an additional element, which is, by the way, the 50% threshold, if satisfied, can change the entire classification of the assets itself.
Yeah, and to add on this, because I saw that Jamie also had a follow-up question asking what happens when there are multiple renovations on different schedules throughout the year. And there also, like, this 50% threshold probably can be applied for seeing when a project started or when a project ended. When, for example, you have a renovation that covers more than 50% of your assets floor area, or needs to reallocate like more than 50% of your tenants, then this would be like the start of your project. And as soon as then maybe certain part of this renovation is over, but different part starts, but this is then a lower threshold part of your assets, and the majority of your assets might then be operational, then actually you might disregard, so to say, this minor renovation and already report your asset again as a standing investment, meaning as an operational asset to us.
Yeah, I think in this case too, Jamie, if you want to reach out to us specifically, and we can help you make sure that based on the asset, we define that correctly in the asset spreadsheet, because there are a couple of ways where we can assist. So if it's quite specific, we can help you with that. So next question from Chewy, which is a great question. So assuming that the ownership at 25% triggers the go, no go for asset inclusion, exclusion in the spreadsheet, for the asset spreadsheet, what is GRESB's position in reporting the asset attributes on an equity adjusted basis or reporting on a whole building basis? Is this artificially inflating coverage for an entity submission?
Yes, I already typed this answer in the chat box because I think you typed it there first as well. But since it's a good question, I will answer it here again live as well. As I mentioned earlier, is that when you have like a joint venture, you can always decide whether you report on the full GAF of this asset or only your equity share. However, one requirement that we have is that you always report on the full asset's floor area and performance data. And therefore, there's like no artificially inflating of coverage or adjusting any metrics actually according to your equity share in this asset. You always have to report on the full assets data.
Yeah, and I'm happy to provide a bit more information on this. Chewy, I think we even had a conversation offline on the same topic in the past. You know, up until today, GRESB has always kind of approached this inclusion-exclusion rule following, you know, the notion of influence, which is where we drew the line of 25%. So, and the idea is that, you know, if there is more than 25% ownership in an asset, you should report on the entire assets. Now, if you've noticed, a new field that we've added this year in the asset level spreadsheet, which is optional, is the percentage of ownership at the asset level. And as you can kind of foresee the future, the intention obviously is to refine the GRESB reporting, you know, and by leveraging on that percentage. And eventually, we'd be able to, you know, not only look at what you own at 25% plus, and considering the whole assets, if that condition is satisfied, but we'll be actually able to collect all assets from participants and apply the actual percentage of ownership at the asset level to really come up with a very refined, you know, to come up with a carbon footprint that can be calculated according to you know, the operational approach of the GRESB protocol, the financial approach, or even the equity share approach, which is what you've raised in your question. So I think, long story short, it is very something that we're looking at. It is also something that we're working we're looking at in the context of the assessment development in the coming years. Yeah, more will follow on that topic in the future.
Thanks, Charles, for the clarification, and Max. So for the next question from Ashita, so suppose for an asset vacancy is 50%, and for other it is 100. Can we normalize both the vacancy to 90 for reporting purposes?
So I'll take this one. I'm not so sure if I understand that, because vacancy rate is reported at the asset level. So there is no such a thing that should normalize two vacancies on different assets together for reporting purposes. So in this case, yeah, your first asset would have 50%, and the second one would be 100%, and the consumption data, floor area covered, should be reported accordingly.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. And Ishita, if you want to respond or submit a contact form to us, we can help you work out your specific case. So next question from Jamie. So when there's a car park, but it is under a different property management ownership, are we required to report? If it's the same ownership but different management, are we required to report? So two different situations here.
Yes. So the first situation, if it's not, if you don't own this car park, you should not report it, because our assessment just should only reflect your portfolio, your assets. But in the second case, if you own this car park, then it comes to the point if this car park is sub-metered compared to your asset, or if it's not. If it is sub-metered, you can report this car park separately. We do have a specific property subtype for parking indoors. And if it's not sub-metered, then you should report this car park together with your whole asset and include the consumption of the car park and your asset submission.
Nice, thanks, Victor. And then so the next one from Nelly. So are GRESB members asked to sign this participant agreement? So yes, we are all GRESB members, participant members, and you know, anyone submitting their data to GRESB is required to sign this participant agreement in 2021. And really the purpose of this is to strengthen the protection of your data from your side and also ours. So it really formalizes the relationship of you submitting your data to GRESB, and also formalizes our membership together. In the end, GRESB is a membership organization, and we have switched to that structure so that all participants are recognized as GRESB members and, you know, can contribute to us in that way. So if you have specific questions about the agreement, myself or Ruben are happy to answer that. Yeah. So, and then the next question from Jamie. So this is about waste. This one's quite long and it's the last question in the box. So I won't read this one, but Max, if you want to take it.
Yeah, sure. Do you read it or should I?
Oh, sorry. No, I think anyone can just read it that's still on the call. That's the last one.
Okay, fair. Yeah, I mean, waste data is always like a little bit of a tricky topic overall. However, the question here is like whether you can actually estimate the total volume of your waste based on number of bins that, for example, have been taken out or actually were picked up. In this case, we actually do allow this estimation when you have a number of bins and the weight per of a full bin. This most likely will actually overstate your total waste generation anyway, and therefore this is definitely an acceptable method for you to actually estimate your waste data and to report to us.
Yeah, nice. Oh, Charles, go for it.
Yeah, just I would recommend, obviously, in order to go from volume to weight, you need a conversion factor, and we would recommend, to as much as possible to use a reliable conversion factor, and ideally something that really is something that you've determined yourself based on your own waste consumption in the past. In that sense, you can use the conversion factor. You can calculate and estimate. It's always an estimation, of course. You can estimate the conversion factor once, and maybe do spot checks on a regular basis as to make sure that this conversion factor still applies, so that you don't need to rely on a conversion factor that you found, that's something that applies to at region level or in your municipality. Really something that you've calculated yourself to make sure that the resulting waste weight that you've calculated is something that is sensible to report.
Okay, thanks, Charles. And then I did see a raised hand from Claire. I'm not really sure how to proceed with that, but Claire, if you want to type something in the chat box, we do have a couple of slides I'll close out with, so you do have time to let us know. And now Charles has raised his hand as well. So I'll finish out with just a couple of slides, and if anyone has anything, please pop it into the Q&A or chat box. So just a reminder of the resources you have available to you. So we have documents.gresb.com, which is the reference guide, scoring document, and assessment, as well as plenty of resources available for you. And then as Victor touched on, the validation flowchart and aggregation rule handbook are new for this year. So yeah, I'd recommend anyone to check those out. We also have the GRESB online training platform. So I think there's over 1,200 users who have signed up for our online training. And these are various videos covering, many topics within the assessment. We also have a section on the infrastructure, which is our other side of our business. So if anyone is interested in learning a bit about infrastructure, that is covered on this online training platform. Noting here that the online training platform is a separate login from your GRESB login. And then lastly, we have our GRESB contact form, which I'm sure many of you have been working with Izzy. We also have Max, Victor, Christina, and various other people on the team who respond to you from our help desk. And we very much aim to get back to you within 2 business days. So it's quite a quick turnaround. And then lastly, well, before I close it out, I do see one question anonymously about percentage data coverage in the waste section. So I'm not sure that this would be really any different from how you would the data coverage is actually calculated based on the floor areas for which you've defined of the asset. So you're not defining what the data coverage is. This is based on the aggregation of your portfolio when you're aggregating the asset spreadsheet into the assessment portal. So I think that covers that. We're happy to help clarify anything else through the contact form if you would like. So with that, we're right at time, which is great. Yeah, 1 minute before. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks everyone from the real estate team for your input here. We know this is a super busy time of the year, so thanks for taking the time for that. Please reach out if you have any questions through the contact form. I'm sure there'll be many submitted, over the coming weeks. So good luck with the rest of the process, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.